I don't usually talk about this case, not with family, not with old colleagues, not even when I've had a few drinks and the guys start swapping the strangest things they've seen on the job. There's a reason for that, and you'll probably understand it by the end. But since you asked me about the strangest call I ever answered, the kind that never makes it into official reports, I can tell you this much. It happened in late October of 1998, up in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, not far from Silverton. At the time, I was still with the San Juan County Sheriff's Office, and I'd been working a mix of patrol and investigations. Most of our calls were typical mountain county stuff: lost hikers, snowmobilers stranded in early storms, the occasional drunk miner causing trouble at the Brown Bear Cafe. But every so often something came across my desk that felt different, heavier, like the air around the paperwork itself wanted me to pay attention. That's what this was. I remember it was the morning of October 27th. The first snow had already fallen on Red Mountain Pass, and the plows had carved their rough tracks along US 550, the $1 million highway, as we call it. A local couple from Durango had reported their adult son missing. His name was Daniel Whitaker, 28 years old, worked seasonal jobs, mostly trail guiding in summer and part-time at a ski lodge in Telluride in the winter. He'd gone camping alone somewhere off an old mining road near Animas Forks, an abandoned ghost town about 12 miles northeast of Silverton. Daniel had been gone for 5 days, and his last message to his mother, left on their answering machine on the 22nd, was short and strange. He said he'd found something worth seeing and that he'd call again soon. But he never did. Missing persons in the backcountry weren't unusual for us, but there was something about this one that set my nerves on edge right away. Maybe it was the location. Animas Forks had a reputation, at least among locals and the older deputies. The town had been abandoned since the early 1900s, when the mines dried up, but its ruins, weather-beaten cabins, collapsing mills, rusted machinery, still stood like bones in the thin mountain air. Every year we got at least one report from tourists or hikers about hearing voices, seeing lantern lights moving between the cabins, or feeling like someone was watching them from the timberline. Usually we laughed it off, but privately, I'd always thought there was something peculiar about that place. Whenever I'd had to go up there on patrol, I couldn't shake the sense of being observed, even when the wind was still and the valley completely empty. The case file included a map Daniel's friend had drawn for the family, showing where he liked to camp, about 2 miles beyond Animas Forks, near the base of Storm Peak. The area was rugged, high-altitude terrain, with remnants of mining tunnels and half-buried tracks scattered through the scree fields. I'd been there before. It wasn't a place I would have chosen for a solo trip. I remember sitting at my desk, looking at the case notes, when the dispatcher, Marie, walked by and said, "Another one up the forks, huh? That place eats people." She laughed afterward, but it didn't sound like a real joke. Later that afternoon, I called Daniel's mother, Linda. She was desperate, her voice trembling through the line, but she kept repeating one thing that unsettled me. He said it was worth seeing. He wouldn't have said that if it wasn't true. He wasn't like that. He didn't make things up. I asked her what she thought he meant, and she said, "I don't know." But he sounded different, like he'd seen something that had changed him. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mountains were on my mind, and so was the fact that Halloween was only a few days away. Maybe I was letting local folklore creep under my skin, but the timing felt ominous. Early settlers and miners had told plenty of stories about the San Juans: shadows that moved on their own, phantom riders on the passes, cries in the woods that didn't belong to any animal. The Ute people, who lived here long before the miners, considered certain valleys forbidden, places where the boundaries between the living and the dead thinned out. Most of us brushed those stories aside, but I'd heard enough strange things in my career to know that not everything fit neatly into reports and evidence bags. On the morning of October 29th, I loaded up the department's old Chevy Blazer with camping gear, extra fuel, and a radio. Officially, it was a missing persons search. Unofficially, it felt like walking into a story I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of. The sky was already gray when I headed north out of Silverton, and snow clouds were piling over the peaks. I stopped at the edge of town for coffee, and the clerk at the station An older man named Ray asked where I was headed. When I told him, his face darkened. Storm Peak, he said. You be careful up there. Folks don't always come back the same. I laughed it off at the time, but his words stayed with me as I drove higher into the mountains, the road narrowing, the cliffs dropping off into white emptiness. By the time I reached Animas Forks, the daylight was already weak, the cabins casting long shadows on the snow. I parked near the largest ruin, shut off the engine, and for a moment just listened. The silence was heavy, pressing, like the whole valley was holding its breath. I remember thinking, if Daniel really had found something worth seeing out here, maybe I wasn't prepared for what that meant. I set out on foot just as the weak sun disappeared behind the peaks, pulling my jacket tighter and adjusting the pack on my shoulders. The snow was soft and deep in places, but I could still make out faint tracks that might have belonged to Daniel or someone else. The mining road twisted upward, cutting through stands of spruce and aspen, and every few steps I thought I saw movement in the treeline. Nothing ever materialized, just shadows that vanished when I blinked. By late afternoon, I reached the first cluster of collapsed cabins, and that's when the unease began to turn physical. The air itself felt thicker, almost viscous, and my radio crackled intermittently with static even though the frequency was clear. I stopped to check it, but the signal came back fine. Then I noticed that small things were off. The footprints, whatever they were, didn't always make sense. Some led up to a cabin and disappeared right through the wall, as if the snow had swallowed them, and the same happened on the other side. At first, I blamed the wind or my eyes playing tricks, but there was a pattern. The tracks always reappeared just a few dozen feet away, sometimes heading in directions that defied the slope of the terrain. I made a mental note, and my stomach nodded. I circled the ruins slowly, scanning for signs of recent human activity. I found footprints around the perimeter, yes, but I also found objects that didn't belong. An old tin can of baking powder from the 1930s, a faded leather glove with stitching I didn't recognize, and a journal with pages ripped out. I remember picking up the journal. It had a name on the inside cover, Edgar Monroe, a miner from the turn of the century. But some of the entries were written in pencil on torn scraps of paper, and the words didn't make sense. They were disjointed. He waits where the rocks breathe, do not follow, can see through the pine. I felt a shiver creep down my spine, and I shoved it back into the ruins without thinking. As night fell, I set up a small perimeter around my tent, using the ruins as partial shelter. I kept the radio close and a flashlight within arm's reach. That's when I first heard it. A sound low in the distance, like scraping metal over rock, soft but deliberate. I froze, thinking it might be an animal or a falling branch, but it repeated rhythmically, almost like deliberate steps. I called out, "Daniel? Anyone there?" The wind answered me with a hollow whistle, and then silence, except for the subtle rustling in the timberline. My heart was racing, and I found myself scanning the shadows. Something moved just past the edge of the ruins. A silhouette, hunched, brief, and gone before I could focus. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a drifting shadow, anything. But sleep didn't come. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, and snow began falling again. I huddled in my sleeping bag, hearing soft, almost human sighs carried on the wind. I remember thinking, if Daniel had been here, would he have left signs, or would the mountains have claimed him entirely? By the next morning, I was already uneasy, feeling like the landscape itself had shifted overnight. I followed the tracks further, past the base of Storm Peak. The terrain was steeper here, with loose scree and deep gullies. Then I saw them. 3 figures, standing near the edge of a narrow ledge, motionless, almost statuesque. I squinted, and they vanished. I called out, my voice echoing through the canyon. But there was no response, not even an echo that felt natural. It was as if the air itself had swallowed the sound. That's when I noticed the trees. They weren't quite right. The trunks and branches cast shadows that didn't match the dim morning light, and some of the snow on the ground seemed to shimmer faintly, like frost over ice, but it wasn't frost. I reached out to touch it, and my fingers met nothing but cold air. The tracks I had been following for hours now looped around in a perfect circle, back toward the base of the ruins, as though someone, or something, was leading me in a game I didn't understand. I found remnants of Daniel's campsite, an upturned backpack, a thermos, and a notebook torn in half. One half had writing I could read. "They're watching, he told me not to go." The other half was missing entirely. I remember clutching the notebook and shivering, not from the cold, but from the sense that something alive, unseen, was just out of reach. Over the next 2 days, I scoured the immediate area, tracing the strange loops of tracks, listening for sounds that didn't belong. I encountered more anomalies, small piles of rocks arranged in patterns that made no sense, tree trunks with strange markings not made by tools, and faint whispering that seemed to come from every direction at once. Once, as I crossed a narrow gulch, I heard Daniel's voice calling my name. I froze, scanning the dark timberline, and there was no one. My rational mind said it was the wind or my imagination, but the tone, the urgency, the fear was unmistakable. I pressed forward, compelled to reach the upper reaches of Storm Peak. Each step felt heavier than the last, and I began to notice a sensation that someone, or something, was walking just behind me, keeping pace, yet never visible. That night, I slept again in the ruins, but the air was different. The snow had stopped, leaving the valley bathed in an eerie silver light from the full moon. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and every time I closed my eyes, I imagined figures standing at the edges of the clearing, watching, waiting. I could no longer tell which sounds were real. The snap of branches, the whispering, the soft laughter, all blended into one unidentifiable presence. By the third day, I was exhausted and beginning to question my own senses, but I couldn't give up. Daniel was missing, and I had a promise, unspoken, that I would find him, or at least understand what had happened. The mountains were no longer just rugged terrain. They were active, sentient almost, and I felt as if I had entered a space that obeyed rules different from the outside world. Footsteps would vanish into thin air, objects would appear or disappear inexplicably, and the silence could feel like it was pressing on my chest. I realized then that whatever had taken or hidden Daniel wasn't human, but it wasn't what you'd expect from folklore either. It was something else, something patient, watching, manipulating, and it knew I was here. That night, I made a decision. I would push further into the mountains, toward the highest ridges near Storm Peak. I would follow the tracks, the whispers, the signs, and I would not stop until I either found Daniel or found out why the mountains themselves seemed to have become a living trap. I remember standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at the dark outline of the peak, snow falling lightly around me, and thinking, whatever is up there, it doesn't want to be found. But I have to see it anyway. I started my final push toward the upper slopes of Storm Peak on the morning of November 2nd, 1998, with a thin layer of frost coating every surface, making the terrain treacherous. My map and compass were practically useless at this point. The mountains had taken on a distorted quality, with ridges and gullies shifting in ways that made sense only when you were inside them. The tracks I'd been following, Daniel's, I assumed, led me into a narrow ravine where the trees grew twisted, their branches interlocking above so that almost no light reached the ground. That's when I heard it again. Faint, rhythmic scratching coming from all around me, not just one direction, and beneath it, a low hum, like something vibrating in the earth itself. I froze, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. I told myself it was nothing, maybe wind against the rock, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I moved slowly, every step measured, and that's when I saw it. Daniel's jacket, pinned to a tree with some kind of crude cordage, shredded but unmistakably his. I reached for it, and my fingers brushed the fabric, but it felt wrong, cold in a way that didn't match the air, almost wet, though there was no moisture. Behind me, the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it pressed against my eardrums. Then the wind shifted, and I caught a glimpse of movement, shapes flickering along the ravine walls, dark and tall, just at the edge of vision. I spun around, flashlight sweeping, but there was nothing. Nothing tangible, just shadows that didn't match any tree or rock. My heart hammered, and a chill ran down my spine. I remembered the old miner's journal, the torn entries about where the rocks breathe and he waits. And for the first time, I wondered if Daniel had stumbled upon something deliberately hidden, some secret the mountains were keeping. I pressed on, climbing toward a small plateau I knew from topographical maps should exist, but when I reached it, it wasn't there. Instead, a clearing opened up that shouldn't have existed. Jagged rock formations forming a natural amphitheater, and in the center, the ground was unnaturally bare, snow cleared away as if by hand. At the edge, I saw footprints that weren't human. The soles were elongated, narrow, and the depth was inconsistent, as if weight had been applied unevenly. I followed them, stepping carefully, when I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Don't come closer." I froze. It was Daniel's. My stomach twisted. "Daniel, it's me," I shouted, but the voice echoed strangely, bouncing off the rocks, distorted, almost laughing. The shadows shifted, condensing into forms I could no longer identify. I realized I wasn't just observing something. I was being observed, studied, tested. I found myself at the entrance of a collapsed mine shaft that Daniel had marked on the old map. The mouth of the tunnel was narrow, but I could hear movement deep within. Something breathing, soft scraping, and then a whisper, "Why did you follow me?" I swallowed hard, telling myself it was him. But there was a quality to the sound that didn't belong to a human throat. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling across the walls, catching on rusted beams and broken carts. And then I saw him, Daniel. At first I thought he was dead, slumped against a support beam, covered in frost and dirt. But as I approached, he lifted his head, eyes wide and unblinking, staring past me as if he were seeing something on a plane I couldn't perceive. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse and strange. "I don't know if I should have come here. You shouldn't be here." I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him toward the surface, but it was like his body had grown heavier, resisting me. The shadows in the shaft thickened, rising along the walls, forming shapes I couldn't describe. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in near total darkness, except for a faint phosphorescent glow from cracks in the rock. The glow illuminated the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. Symbols etched into the walls, not by tools, but by something that seemed to have scraped the rock itself with claws or talons, arranged in patterns that made no sense, yet carried a weight, a kind of language I couldn't comprehend. Daniel began whispering again, words fragmented. They're not angry, just waiting for the next step." I asked him what he meant, but his eyes rolled back briefly, and he fell silent, staring straight ahead. Then, from the darkness, I felt it, a presence, immense, enveloping, pressing against my chest, not violent, but overwhelming. I couldn't move, couldn't think, and time itself seemed to stretch. I could hear whispers, faint and unintelligible, echoing off the walls, circling me like a swarm. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The pressure lifted, the shadows receded, and I could breathe again. Daniel blinked, looking at me with recognition, his body slack but alive. I helped him to his feet, guiding him out of the mine shaft. As we emerged into the moonlit clearing, the footprints were gone, the bare ground smooth again, as if nothing had happened. The symbols in the tunnel were gone too, replaced by normal rock. Daniel couldn't speak at first, only shivering and pointing to the far end of the plateau. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just the mountains, cold and silent. I asked him what he had seen, what had been in that shaft, and he shook his head, unable to articulate it. His hands trembled violently. They show you things you can't take back," he whispered. I didn't question him. We climbed down together, retracing my steps toward the ruins of Animas Forks, each of us quiet, carrying a weight neither of us could explain. By the time we reached the truck, dawn was breaking, the snow reflecting a pale orange light. The mountains loomed above us, silent, indifferent. Daniel refused to speak further, and when we reached Silverton, he barely answered questions. I filed the official report. Missing person found, no injuries, safe. But the truth was far from that. That night, back in my cabin, I pored over my notes and the torn pieces of Daniel's journal I had recovered. I couldn't reconcile the events, the voices, the symbols, the shadows. It felt like the mountains themselves had rewritten reality, marking us, changing our perception of time and space. I thought I'd seen it all in my career, but that plateau, that shaft, those moments of weightless terror, they had altered me. I could never walk those passes alone again without feeling unseen eyes watching, waiting. Something in the San Juans had been patient, meticulous, and it had no intention of being understood. And whatever it was, it still waits there, beyond the peaks, beyond human understanding, in the cold silence where the wind carries whispers and footsteps that disappear into nothing. After we returned to Silverton, life resumed its outward normalcy, but nothing about me, or Daniel, was ever the same. Officially, the case was closed, missing hiker found, unharmed, no further investigation required. But in the days and weeks afterward, I noticed things that couldn't be explained by routine stress or coincidence. I would pass the foot of Storm Peak from the highway, and for a split second, it felt alive, as if the slopes themselves had shifted when I wasn't looking. Shadows would dart across the valley at odd angles, even in midday, and my sleep was haunted by fragments of what we had encountered in the mine. Daniel moved back to Durango, tried to resume normal life, but he was silent, withdrawn. Friends reported he would sometimes disappear for hours, wandering into the woods, muttering about seeing them or hearing whispers. I never accompanied him. I had my own demons to deal with. I would go out on patrol less frequently, citing family reasons, but the truth was I couldn't bear to set foot on that stretch of mountain road again. One evening, a week after our return, I visited the ruins of Animas Forks to collect the remaining pieces of Daniel's journal I had stored in a box. The snow had melted slightly, leaving the ground muddy and uneven. I noticed faint tracks leading from the ruins into the timberline, tracks that I was certain I hadn't seen before, not from me, not from Daniel. They led straight to the base of Storm Peak, then stopped. There was nothing else. I told myself it was animals, or the wind had shaped the mud strangely, but the unease in my gut refused to subside. Over the following months, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps Daniel had suffered a breakdown, wandering into an abandoned mine shaft and hallucinating shadows and voices. Perhaps the journal had influenced him, or perhaps my own mind had been pushed to the brink by isolation and fear. But some facts resisted explanation. The symbols in the shaft that disappeared, the footprints that defied logic, the way the shadows seemed sentient. I began to study local history more closely, poring over old mining records, settler diaries, and Ute oral accounts. Many of them described anomalies in this part of the San Juans, areas where travelers became disoriented, where sounds echoed strangely, where people swore they were being watched by invisible presences. It wasn't just folklore. Multiple accounts, across decades, hinted at something consistent, something persistent in the landscape. And yet, the mountains themselves seemed indifferent. They didn't pursue us or punish us. They merely existed, in a state we couldn't fully grasp. Years later, I would sometimes hike with colleagues in other parts of the state, and I realized I had become hyper-aware of anomalies. A path that felt too quiet, a shadow that lingered longer than light should allow, a whisper in the wind. My career continued, but I was never fully the same. The San Juan case became something I filed away internally, alongside other strange incidents I'd witnessed in my life, never spoken aloud except in moments of trust or confession. Daniel eventually recovered enough to live independently, but he refused ever to speak in detail about what he experienced. Once, years later, I saw him in a cafe in Durango. He looked older than his age, tense, like he carried a weight he couldn't set down. We exchanged nods, no words. I understood then that whatever had touched us on Storm Peak wasn't something we could share, explain, or even acknowledge fully. Some things in the mountains are patient, waiting across decades for the right eyes to see, the right ears to hear. I think about the missing pieces of Daniel's journal sometimes. The ones we never found, the ones that might explain or maybe even invite the phenomena we encountered. I never went back to that plateau, never tried to confront whatever had been in that shaft. But sometimes, in the silence before dawn, I can still feel the mountains watching, aware of my presence even hundreds of miles away. The San Juans are not cursed in a conventional sense, but they are a place where human understanding is fragile. And for those of us who have glimpsed what they hide, there is no forgetting. I often wonder if we were lucky, or if luck had nothing to do with it. The shadows, the voices, the footprints that vanish, they are all still there, waiting, patient beyond comprehension. I share this only because I need to, though I know most will dismiss it. But if you ever find yourself in those mountains, around Animas Forks or the upper slopes of Storm Peak, and you hear a faint whisper calling your name, or notice footprints that shouldn't exist, remember this: the mountains see everything. They don't act out of malice. They simply observe, and some things, once observed, cannot be unseen. I left the sheriff's office shortly after that season, citing stress and relocation. But the truth is that the mountains had left their mark on me, an imprint deeper than any badge or gun could leave. I've tried to live a normal life since, but every November, when the first snow falls, I think about Daniel, the mine, and the whispers in the timberline. Some nights, I still wake up sweating, hearing that low hum beneath the earth, the rhythm of scraping metal over stone, and I remember the patience of the San Juans, and how it felt to be watched by something older, smarter, and infinitely patient. I've told this story now because it needs to exist in some form, somewhere between fact and memory. The mountains may keep their secrets, but they cannot prevent us from speaking them once we've been changed. And I was changed irrevocably by what I found, or what found me, among the peaks, shadows, and silence of Storm Peak.